Welcome back. I'm still talking to political and social commentator James Melville. James, we'll move on to the dubious policy of building schools out of Aero bars later. But first, still with schools, the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris, next slide please, Whitty, has today said that if kids have got runny noses, sore throats and sniffles, they should go to school. And the reason he says this is because if they don't go to school, it increases their anxiety. They may suffer from anxiety. He didn't seem to worry too much about school pupils' anxiety when his fanatical lockdown policies closed schools for basically 2 years. He didn't seem too concerned about their anxiety then. This is a bit of a kind of change of direction for the Chief Medical Officer, isn't it?
It is. I think there's a number of components, as you well know, that I had a problem with over the COVID response. But I think ultimately, the most grotesque one was what they did to our children. You know, they called them super spreaders, you know, granny killers, you know, wear the mask in school, coerced into taking jabs. You know, there was a number of different components. And on the byproduct of that was the collateral damages in terms of kids' welfare and mental health, and also not seeing their friends and their loved ones. It was appalling what happened to our kids. It's a bit rich for him to say the thing that he should have actually said back in the pandemic. Yeah. I was a believer that the kids should have stayed at school, and a lot of evidence would suggest that that should have happened now. And hopefully our government have learned from their mistakes back in 2020 and 21. And I think fundamentally what they did to our children was one of the most appalling things over that whole period. But for Whitty to say that, yes, he's right. Well, I wish he'd said that 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, this is the man who kept, effectively, because he was a lockdown fanatic, he kept kids out of school for 2 years. Now he's worried about their anxiety if they stay out of school for 1 day. It's not much consistency in that line of thought, is there?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, it's, you know, they've got sniffles, they've got colds. They should be at school.
I agree with that.
They don't want to be told to lock down because of sniffles and colds. In the same way, the kids should have been at school back in 2020 and 21. They missed months of education. And actually, for kids in poorer backgrounds, there's thousands that didn't actually return to school after that. Yeah. Or they didn't have the ways and means at home financially to learn from home. Yeah. They couldn't afford the Wi-Fi bills, they couldn't afford a laptop. Not everyone was like a middle-class, upper-class kid who could basically go on Zoom or whatever it was and do online learning over that time. Thousands of kids dropped out of the system. And again, that isn't properly discussed, and it should be discussed within our overall COVID response review. I think a major part of that should be the overall impact on our kids. Our futures fundamentally and the various damages, collateral damages that were caused during COVID. So while Whitty's saying this now, which is basically common sense, that should have been said back in 2020. If you look at Sweden, for instance, Sweden, the one country that didn't lock down, didn't have mask mandates, didn't shut the schools. Guess which country has the lowest excess deaths between 2020 and 2022? Yeah. What a surprise. Yeah.
Let me take a wild guess. Sweden, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, let's stick with schools. The crumbling concrete crisis. They built the schools from 1950 to the mid-1990s from this aerated concrete, the kind of stone's answer to Aero bars. And guess what? It's not very safe, and many schools are falling down. So there's this big safety alert. Some kids haven't been able to go back to school. The government were warned about this. Well, some say they were warned about it back in the 90s. But they certainly got a very serious warning 5 years ago. They did nothing about it. For some reason, they suddenly swung into action just before term a couple of days ago, clearly in some kind of a panic. The Education Secretary, the 7th that we've had in 5 years, Gillian Keegan, seems to think that she's been doing an effing good job responding to this crisis. And Nick Gibb, the Schools Minister, incredibly, yesterday was quoted as praising the government for, listen, its world-beating response to the concrete crumbling crisis. Well, what do you mean world-beating? Where else are all the schools falling down because they built them out of Aero bars? It's a ridiculous thing to say. This government are now Rishi is saying, yes, we've responded with great skill and brilliance to this situation, and everything's fine and they'll all be okay fairly soon. I mean, they're trying to sort of say that somehow or other they're admirable in this situation. It's an absolute shambles.
It is. It's like, I've heard some of those interviews the last 2 days. It's like something out the thick of it. I mean,
Yes.
this is sort of, it's just ridiculous. I mean, if you look again, we have overall in the round one of the highest tax burdens in Europe. And what are we actually getting for that? I mean, you get, again, go back to Sweden again. They do as well with their income tax, but they get world-class public services. In particular, they get great educational establishments. That's part of their social contract. That's why the public buy into paying higher tax there, because they're actually confident that they're going to get a return on it. We're not getting that here. The basic premise of spending our money to the government is about good governance, competence, trustworthiness on a basic sort of ethical level, but then underneath it, in terms of where they spend their money. And what I would say one of the red lines to ensure success of our taxpayer money, return on investment, is making sure that our schools function. And we've got crumbling infrastructures. It's not just schools, other public buildings as well. I suspect we're only at the start of the story. There'll be more to come. And therefore, that is a question, therefore, we asked about competency again and what our money is actually being spent on. So instead of spending it on terrible things like, you know, dodgy PPE contracts and the endless pipeline of money to the Ukraine, or net zero projects that aren't going to make a blind bit of difference, or HS2, what about spending it on the sensible things, like making sure that our kids are getting a decent education in a schools with the right facilities? You could actually argue this is also something can apply to other aspects as well. For instance, our NHS will go into the winter again, where there'll be the stories every single winter saying NHS is in crisis, facilities are crumbling.
Yeah.
It's the same pattern over and over again.
Yeah.
And the only people we can blame for this are the government.
Yeah, we got queues starting for NH dentists at 4 a.m. The schools are falling down. The Royal Mail doesn't want to deliver letters except on 3 days a week. And councils are in a real mess. Last word, James, swiftly if you can. Your thoughts on Birmingham Council, which has basically gone bankrupt. It has a budget of £3.2 billion a year, but it basically contrived to pay women less than men for doing the same jobs. They got sued. They owe 761 million equal pay claims. They've got to pay that up. They also spent £100 million on an IT system that doesn't work. And last year, they put £284 million, or £200 million, I think it was, into funding the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, and now they go, oh, we haven't got any money. I mean, it's a Labour administration. The leader of the Labour Council has responded to this crisis by going to New York to celebrate his 50th birthday. I mean, this is a disgrace, isn't it?
It is. It's terrible management on all different, but it's not just Birmingham. I was looking into, actually, a lot of other councils are pretty perilous financial situation as well. Where they're having to restrict spend. Again, it comes back to, well, where's our money being spent on at a council tax level? Where is it going? What is going on, it seems to be, is bad management, bad systems, a lack of auditing and sort of identification of where the money should be spent and what actually works within the local authorities, and also structures in terms of expenses and pay on every single level. It's mismanagement. And yet we are the ones, like, once again, who are funding this. And I think that the local authority story is likely to grow. And on this one, it's not just a case of blaming the national government. Yes, there's been cuts in terms of local authorities. That's fine. That's one aspect to this. The other aspect is the points that you've just mentioned. Bad management practices within the councils and wastage of taxpayers' money. I suspect Birmingham will not be the last on this. Looking at some of the figures that I did today on other councils across the country, there's a lot of councils that are pretty close to facing the situation that Birmingham are in right now.
I wouldn't say this is exclusively a Labour problem, but you will find, as in the case of Birmingham, that most of these administrations going bankrupt will be Labour. They're not very good with money, so if you want to vote for Keir Starmer, you'll get that on a national basis. James, great to talk to you. Thank you very much. That was James Melville, political and social commentator.